On my birthday, she leaned across the table, smiled just enough for the cameras nearby, and said, "You're forgettable." The word didn't land like an insult. It slid in like a blade someone pretends is just a butter knife. People around us laughed, thinking it was a joke. I laughed too, because what else can you do when your dignity is bleeding in public? But inside, my mind took a photograph of her face, her tone, the way she reached for her wine before the sentence had even cooled in the air. I'd known this woman for years. I'd fed her in my kitchen when she couldn't afford a cup of coffee at a cafe. I'd sat with her during the worst night of her life, listening as she poured herself into words that trembled like glass. And now here she was, erasing me in real time, sealing the moment with a sip, as though my absence in her memory was something charming. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that people say cruel things when they feel safe enough to believe you'll never challenge them. But that night, when the guests were gone and the plates still held the half-moons of untouched cake, the sentence wouldn't leave. Forgettable. It was the kind of word you can hear in your sleep. The kind of word that rewrites every moment you thought was shared. A week later, I saw her again, only this time not in person. She was on the front page of a glossy magazine holding her newest book, smiling like she had just invented truth itself. I almost walked past, almost. But then the title pulled me back. It was poetic, haunting, familiar, too familiar. I bought the book, sat in my car, and read the first page. My hands began to shake before I reached the second. She hadn't just remembered my story, she had stolen it. Word for word, heartbreak for heartbreak. Only my name was missing. That's when I understood what she meant that night. She wasn't predicting my forgettability. She was planning it. She had already decided the world would hear my story without ever knowing it was mine. And I didn't yet know it. But in that moment, the most unforgettable thing I would ever do had just begun. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow the channel and bring more stories like this to you. And now, let's continue. Months later, I was walking past a bookstore I rarely visited. The glass was bright with winter reflections, the kind that make it hard to see what's inside. But in the center of the display, standing taller than the rest, was a book. The title was etched in a font that seemed to lean toward you, promising something intimate. The author's name, in bold above it, was one the world loved, someone who could sell out a hall with a single announcement. I might have kept walking. I might have told myself I didn't have time. But something about the subtitle, a quiet echo of a phrase I had once whispered to her on a night when the only audience was the dark, stopped me cold. I stepped closer, pressing my hands to the cold glass, staring. My reflection overlapped with hers on the cover. The description on the back spoke of loss that reshaped a life, of a moment so sharp it cut years into a before and an after. Every detail rang like a bell in my bones. It wasn't just the shape of the story, it was its breath, its pulse. Even the smallest griefs I had once told her in confidence were here, printed and polished, wrapped in her voice as if they had been born there. I walked into the store without thinking. The paper smell hit me, ink and promises. I picked up the book, my fingers tightening around it as I turned to the first chapter. And there it was, the opening scene. My opening scene. Down to the chipped mug, the rain against the kitchen window, the silence between two people who could no longer find each other's eyes. I had lived that moment once, and here I was, living it again, only this time as a stranger in my own life. I read standing in the aisle, my coat still buttoned, my breath uneven. Page after page I found my scars under her fingerprints, my private moments, the ones I had never spoken outside the safety of my own walls, were now bound and sold for $29.95, and with each sentence, the same thought repeated in my head, not in anger yet, not even in disbelief, but in a cold, settling clarity. She hadn't forgotten me at all. She had studied me, memorized me, worn my life like a coat until it fit her perfectly. By the time I closed the book, the store around me was gone. The chatter of customers, the hum of the heating vents, even the ringing of the register faded beneath the weight of a truth I couldn't yet say out loud. She had built her triumph on my wounds, dressed her success in the fabric of my pain. And I understood now. The night she called me forgettable wasn't cruelty thrown carelessly into the air. It was a prelude. She had already decided whose name would survive the telling, and it wasn't mine. I turned the pages slowly, as if each one might suddenly correct the mistake, as if somewhere in the margins there would be a name, my name, quietly printed, giving me back what had been taken. But there was nothing. No dedication that hinted at the nights I'd spent telling her the shape of my grief. No footnote marking the truth that the words she was now celebrated for had first been breathed in my kitchen, long before they ever touched her pen. Every paragraph was a mirror I had not asked to stand in front of, and yet here I was, staring at my own life refracted through someone else's reflection. I reached the chapter where my loss lived, the real one, the one I'd spent years trying not to revisit. She described it in such detail that I could almost smell the air of that day, feel the same weight in my chest that had nearly split me in two. She wrote it beautifully, I'll admit that. The cadence of the sentences, the quiet pauses, the way each word was chosen like a flower for a funeral. She had kept all of it intact, except for the part where it was mine. I searched for anything that might tie it back to me, anything to prove I hadn't imagined the theft, a passing reference, a subtle nod, even a vague inspired by. But the only names that appeared were hers, on the cover, in the interviews, in the praise dripping from reviewers who called her a voice for the voiceless. My voice, my story, my years of living through something that could break a person twice before letting them breathe again. She had taken it all, polished it until it gleamed, and handed it to the world as her creation. And the world, hungry for beauty, deaf to the origins of pain, had applauded. The applause wasn't gentle either. It was everywhere, in the front page features, in the televised readings, in the awards that came with gold seals and checks that could buy silence 100 times over. Each headline felt like a door closing. Each photo of her signing copies another reminder that the story didn't just belong to someone else now. It had been rewritten to pretend I never existed at all. I closed the book, my thumb still marking the place where my turning point had been dressed up and sold. Outside, the world went on as if nothing had shifted, but I felt the slow rearranging of my own spine, the subtle tilt in my breathing. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something quieter, more dangerous, the steady awareness that she had underestimated me, that she believed erasing my name was the same as erasing my presence. She was wrong. It hadn't been a stranger who stole my story. That would have been easier to accept, an impersonal theft, the kind you can file away under "life isn't fair" and eventually forget. No, this was someone whose presence had once been stitched into my days, who had walked through my front door without knocking, who knew where I kept the coffee and how I liked it poured. She had been in my kitchen on the nights when sleep wouldn't come, sitting across from me at the small wooden table, elbows resting on the same ring-shaped stains that had marked 100 conversations before. She'd lean forward, fingers curled around a chipped mug, eyes steady, and say, "Tell it all, don't hold back. I'm listening." And I had. God help me, I had. I'd told her the details I'd never shared with anyone else, not because I trusted easily, but because she'd made me believe that holding it in was killing me, and letting it out would save me. I told her about the moment I realized love could end without warning, about the phone call that felt like a guillotine, about the nights I sat in the dark waiting for the world to feel solid again. I gave her the unvarnished truth, every sharp edge, every crack in the surface, thinking she was catching it gently, holding it for me like something precious. Looking back now, I can still remember how intently she'd watch me when I spoke, as if committing not just my words but my pauses, my hesitations, my smallest expressions to memory. At the time, I thought it was compassion. Now I see it for what it was, archiving. She was storing my life, my language, the rhythm of my hurt, as if each detail were a bead she'd one day string into a necklace and wear as her own. The worst part wasn't even the theft. It was realizing that while I was talking to her, bearing the parts of myself I rarely let breathe. She was already deciding how to rearrange them into something that would benefit her. My confidences weren't safe in her hands. They were raw material, and she'd mined me completely down to the last fragment of a memory, the last line of a confession I had once believed was private. It is a particular kind of betrayal when the person who convinces you to speak is the one who takes your voice and walks away with it. And sitting there in the bookstore that day, with her book still warm from my grip, I understood something chilling. She hadn't just listened too well. She'd listened with intent. She had come to my table not to share my burden, but to collect it, polish it, and one day sell it back to the world, with her name etched across the cover. And the world, not knowing, would cheer her for it. Every interview was another knife, slipped in with the precision of someone who knew exactly where the soft places were. I began to hear her voice everywhere, on the radio during my drive to work, on television in the evenings when I was just trying to quiet the day, in online clips shared by friends who didn't know they were delivering me a fresh wound. She would sit there, framed by the flattering light of the studio, her hands folded like she was holding something fragile, and talk about the creative process as though she had dug these moments from the depths of her own soul. She spoke of imagined grief as if she had invented pain from air. She smiled when she said artistry, leaning on the word like it absolved her from the weight of honesty. I listened as she described the turning points in her story, points I knew intimately because they had once split my own life in two. She painted them in delicate strokes, soft enough to be palatable to the masses, yet still drenched in the authenticity she had siphoned from me. People adored her for it. They called her brave and visionary, and a voice for those who can't speak. I sat there, hearing my own voice in her mouth, and wondered how many people had been inspired by her words without ever knowing the soil they'd been stolen from. The worst moments were the questions from the hosts, earnest, admiring questions about how she had come to create such vivid characters, such raw emotion. She would tilt her head slightly, as if embarrassed by the praise, and then tell a carefully constructed half-truth about observing people and imagining the possibilities of their lives. She made theft sound like empathy. She made my history sound like a fable spun from her own imagination, and every time she did, I could almost feel another stitch unraveling in the fabric of my own identity. What the public didn't know was that the grief they applauded had once been lived in real time, in real skin, in a real house where windows stayed closed for months because the outside world felt too sharp to breathe in. What they didn't know was that the raw honesty they claimed could only be born of genius had actually been born of survival. Mine. She had repackaged that survival into something beautiful and marketable, and now they lined up outside bookstores to thank her for it. I used to think there was nothing more lonely than living through pain that no one could see. I was wrong. The loneliest thing is watching the world celebrate your pain in someone else's hands, hearing strangers call it art while you sit in the shadows, stripped of the right to say, "That was mine." And yet, buried under the ache, something else began to stir, a quiet, stubborn truth. If she could use my story to build her platform, then I could use the truth to burn it to the ground. She had the public's ear, yes. But I still had something she didn't know how to hold on to. I had the original story, and I had nothing left to lose. At first, I convinced myself that silence was the higher road. I told myself that the truth didn't need applause to keep breathing, that it could survive without headlines, without my name stamped across it. I imagined my story as a seed buried deep in the ground, hidden, yes, but still alive. Let her take the sun, I thought. Let her take the stage lights and the signatures on crisp first editions. I didn't need them. What mattered was that I had lived it, endured it, and walked out the other side. That was enough, or so I thought. The book had been out for months by then. It floated through the world like a bright balloon, untethered from its origin. Friends would mention it casually, unaware of the quiet storm that rose in me each time. I got used to pretending I hadn't read it, hadn't noticed the eerie symmetry between her chapters and my life. My silence became a habit, a daily act of self-erasure disguised as maturity. I told myself I was sparing both of us a public war. I told myself I was choosing peace. Then one afternoon, my niece came to visit. She's young, bright-eyed, still living in a world where stories feel like magic rather than currency. She was carrying the book, hugging it to her chest like it was something precious. She sat down beside me and began flipping through it, her voice bubbling as she read lines aloud. Lines I knew. Lines that had come from my own mouth in moments when I'd been too raw to care how the words sounded. She read them as if they belonged to the woman on the cover. Halfway through, she stopped and frowned. "This is so much like what you told me," she said. "The way you described that night, the rain, even the part about the clock on the kitchen wall. Did she write it about you? Why isn't your name in here?" I froze. In that single question, she had sliced open the careful bandages I'd been wrapping around myself for months. She didn't mean to accuse, but in her innocence, she'd laid the truth bare. My absence wasn't just a private ache anymore. It was visible, obvious, glaring to anyone who looked closely enough. And hearing it from her, hearing the confusion in her voice, turned my quiet resolve into something brittle and breaking. I realized then that my silence wasn't noble. It wasn't peaceful. It was complicity. Every day I kept my mouth shut. I was helping her story stand taller while mine sank deeper into the mud. Every time I swallowed my anger, I was letting her signature harden over my life like cement. And my niece's question made me see what I hadn't wanted to admit. The next generation wouldn't know the truth unless I told it. That night after she left, I sat in my living room with the book on my lap, staring at the cover until the air felt heavy. I understood that saying nothing was no longer a choice. It was surrender, and I had already surrendered enough. It was time to decide not just if I would speak, but how. And when I did, it would be in a way that left no one mistaking whose story had been told. She didn't come for me. In fact, when she first appeared in my life, I wasn't even a name on her list. She was a journalist. One of those sharp-eyed, quietly persistent people who ask more questions with their silences than others do with 100 words. She was researching the celebrated author, chasing a profile piece for a national publication. By then, the woman who had taken my story was more than just an author. She was a brand. Her face smiled from bookstore posters. Her voice carried through lecture halls. Her name trended every time she so much as announced a signing. The journalist's job was simple: tell the world why she mattered. But some people can't help looking under the gloss, and this journalist had a way of hearing what wasn't said. In interview after interview, she noticed the inconsistencies, dates that didn't quite match up, descriptions too precise to have been imagined, turns of phrase that carried the kind of weight only lived experience could forge. And then there were the silences, the moments when the author's voice dipped, eyes shifting, as if certain questions had been answered in private long before they were asked aloud. I learned later that she had started to keep a quiet file, scribbles, clippings, offhand comments that didn't align. And somewhere along the way, she stumbled across my name. It wasn't from the author herself, of course. It was buried in a half-forgotten blog post written years ago, where I had once recounted, in brief and without flourish, the shape of a night that had changed me. A night that just happened to mirror a pivotal scene in the best-selling book, almost word for word. She reached out casually at first, framing it as part of her research into the author's influences. Her email was polite, professional, threaded with curiosity. I nearly deleted it. I'd spent so long guarding my silence that the idea of talking to a stranger about something so raw felt like reopening a wound I had barely managed to stitch closed. But something in her phrasing, an unspoken acknowledgement that she suspected more than she was saying, made me pause. We met in a small cafe, neutral ground. She arrived with nothing but a notebook and a recorder she didn't switch on right away. Instead, she asked me about the weather, about the coffee, about my day, letting the air settle between us before leaning in slightly and saying, "I've been hearing your story, not from you, but from somewhere else, and I think I know where." I didn't answer at first. I just watched her, trying to read her intent. Was she another opportunist? Or was she something rarer, a person who still believed truth was worth the trouble it caused? As she waited, I saw it in her eyes. She wasn't here for gossip. She was here because the puzzle she was building had a missing piece, and she knew I might be it. For the first time in months, I felt something shift inside me. I had been invisible for so long that being seen, even by a stranger, felt dangerous. But it also felt like the beginning of an opening, a crack in the wall I had built so high I'd started to forget there was anything on the other side. And though I didn't yet know how much I would tell her, I knew this. My story had finally found someone who could hear it for what it was, and not for what someone else had turned it into. I spoke as if every word were a stone I had to lift before placing it in front of her. Cautious, deliberate. My voice was steady, but it carried the weight of someone who had learned that too much truth, in the wrong ears, could be used like a weapon. I gave her the shape of my story without carving in the names. I bent the dates, shifted the order of events, let the edges blur just enough to keep the lines from being traced too easily. But even with the details clouded, the emotions slipped through, raw and unfiltered. There are certain things you cannot disguise. Grief has a scent, betrayal has a rhythm, and both lived in my voice. She didn't interrupt, not once. The small red light on her recorder blinked quietly between us, catching the hesitations I didn't realize I was making, the breaths I had to take before certain sentences. She understood the difference between a pause that meant, I'm searching for the right word, and a pause that meant, this part still hurts. Her pen didn't move much. She wasn't here to catch every syllable. She was here to catch the truth that lived underneath them. At one point, I found myself describing the chipped mug, the one that had sat between us in my kitchen on the night she, the author, first convinced me to tell it all. I didn't mean to give that much away, but it came out before I could stop it. And I saw the journalist's eyes sharpen, not with exploitation, but with recognition. She had heard about that mug before. Somewhere in the author's own words, it had appeared, slightly altered, but still mine. As I talked, I noticed how the cafe around us seemed to fade. The clinking cups, the soft hum of conversation, none of it reached me anymore. There was only my voice and her listening, and it struck me how rare that was, to be truly listened to without someone waiting for their turn to speak. It was disarming, it was dangerous, because the more I felt that weight of attention, the more I wanted to stop protecting the parts I had blurred. By the end of the interview, I had given her more than I intended. Not the full story. Never that. Not yet. But enough for her to start weaving the threads together. Enough for her to see where the fabric had been cut from my life and stitched into another's. When I stopped, there was a long silence. She didn't rush to fill it. She simply closed her notebook, clicked off the recorder, and nodded once, like she'd been handed the final corner of a puzzle she'd been working on for months. I left the cafe unsettled. I had walked in determined to keep my distance, to give her only the outlines. Instead, I had opened a door, just a crack, and she had stepped inside. And as much as part of me wanted to slam it shut again, another part, a part I hadn't heard from in a long time, was whispering that maybe it was time to let someone in all the way. Weeks passed before I saw her again, and in that time I almost convinced myself that our first meeting had been a momentary lapse in my resolve, a small leak I could seal before too much truth escaped. But when she returned, it was clear she hadn't come back empty-handed or half-interested. She carried a messenger bag that seemed heavier than its size should allow, the leather worn at the corners from being opened and closed too many times. We sat in the same corner of the cafe, but this time she didn't waste time with small talk. She placed the bag on the table, unzipped it slowly, and began to pull out pieces of my life I hadn't realized were out there in the open. There were early drafts of the book, pages where sentences were crossed out and rewritten, where words that were mine had been reshaped just enough to pass as someone else's. There were printouts of interviews in which the author contradicted herself about where certain ideas had come from. There were scraps of correspondence, emails between her and an editor that hinted, carelessly, almost arrogantly, that inspiration had come from a friend's tragic past. And then there was the last thing she placed in front of me, a statement, scribbled in hurried handwriting on a single page, dated years ago. It was from a former assistant of the author. The journalist had tracked them down, and somewhere in the quiet between questions, they had let it slip. They didn't write it all. Some of it was lived by someone else. The words weren't even trying to be poetic, but they hit me like a verdict. Someone else, as if I were nameless even here, reduced to a shadowy presence whose existence was acknowledged only in the margins. I stared at the page for a long time. My chest felt tight, as if my ribs were trying to shield my heart from the confirmation it had been waiting for. I had always known the truth in the private chambers of my mind, but there is a particular kind of violence in seeing it written down, stripped of deniability. It was no longer a suspicion, it was evidence. She watched me carefully, not pressing, not pushing, just letting the weight of it settle. And as it did, I realized this was no longer about wounded pride. This wasn't just the theft of my story, it was the quiet rewriting of history itself. If I stayed silent, her version would calcify into fact, and mine would dissolve into rumor. The journalist didn't tell me what to do. She didn't need to. The documents, the drafts, the admission, all of it sat between us like an open door I could no longer pretend was locked. I felt the shift in my bones, the slow uncoiling of a decision that had been buried under months of hesitation. She had done her part. Now it was on me. Either I stepped through or I accepted that my story, my life, would forever wear someone else's name. And for the first time since this began, I felt the first faint spark of something that wasn't just grief or anger. It was resolve, sharp enough to cut. In the days after she handed me the evidence, my mind became a reel of imagined confrontations, each one more explosive than the last. I saw myself walking into one of her packed signing events, pushing through the line of adoring readers, stepping right up to the table where she sat with that careful, practiced smile. I'd pick up one of the glossy hardcovers, hold it high so everyone could see, then tear it in half, the sound of paper ripping slicing through the polite bookstore air. I'd throw the pieces on the table, lean close enough for her to hear every word, and say, "This is my life you're selling." The crowd would gasp, cameras would flash, the story would spread in minutes. I played out another version where I interrupted one of her readings. I'd wait until she reached a line I knew by heart, because I had lived it, and then finish the sentence for her, loudly, in front of everyone. I imagined the shock on her face, the confusion on theirs, the sudden wave of realization that the person they'd been applauding had not been the one to walk through the fire. But every time I let those daydreams run to the end, I saw the same flaw. In each one I came away looking smaller, angrier, like someone seeking revenge instead of justice. The confrontation might feed my anger, but it would starve the truth. And I didn't just want her to feel exposed in a moment of chaos. I wanted her theft carved into the public record where no amount of charm or misdirection could cover it again. The temptation to burst in and burn it all down in one scene was strong, almost intoxicating. But I knew the flame would die as quickly as it was lit, and afterward the narrative would be hers to control. She would paint herself as the victim of some jealous acquaintance, twisting the story until my anger became proof of her innocence. That thought chilled me more than silence. No, if I was going to do this, it couldn't be a spectacle. It had to be something bigger, something permanent, something that didn't just make noise but left a mark she couldn't erase, even if she tried for the rest of her life. I wanted the truth to outlive both of us, to sit in archives and articles, to be something that students, researchers, and casual readers would one day stumble across and say, "So this is what really happened." That was the moment I understood my path. I didn't need to destroy her in a single dramatic outburst. I needed to make sure the truth became a matter of record, sturdy, undeniable, and loud enough to reach the ears of people she had convinced for years. I didn't want to steal her spotlight. I wanted to hang my story in the same light, so the difference between the two was impossible to ignore. And with the journalist holding the keys, I finally had a way to do it. The storm inside me began to take shape, not as a burst of rage, but as a plan. And this time I wasn't going to be the one sitting quietly at the table, pouring my life into someone else's hands. This time, I was going to take it back. When I finally called the journalist and told her I was ready, my voice felt like it belonged to someone else. Calm, almost too calm, as if I were about to describe a stranger's life instead of handing over the bones of my own. We met not in the cafe this time, but in a quieter place, a small, dim library room with long wooden tables, where the only sounds were the soft ticking of an old clock and the occasional shuffle of paper. It felt safer there, as if the walls themselves were used to guarding secrets until someone was ready to set them free. I began at the very beginning, the night it happened, the kind of night that doesn't just sit in your memory. It builds a permanent room there. I told her about the stillness before the storm, the way the air had seemed too heavy to breathe, the smell of rain mixing with the faint bitterness of coffee in that chipped mug. I told her the exact words that had been spoken, words so sharp they still found ways to cut me even now. I described how the clock on the wall had seemed louder in the silence afterward, each tick marking the space where my life was splitting into a before and an after. I gave her the things only I could know, the expressions that never made it into her book, the pauses between sentences, the way the light had caught on the steam from the mug and made it look like the air itself was shivering. I told her about the photographs on the counter, face down so I wouldn't have to see them, and the sound of my own breath when I realized nothing about that night could ever be undone. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush me. She listened as though what I was handing her wasn't just a story, but a living, fragile thing that could break if held too tightly. I saw her eyes flicker, not with the excitement of a scoop, but with the gravity of someone who understood the weight she'd just been given. Her pen moved slowly, deliberately, like she was afraid to wound the truth by writing it carelessly. The more I spoke, the more I felt the strange, uneasy release of shedding something I had carried for too long. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was more like finally setting down a box you've been told to hold without ever knowing why. And when I reached the end, the true end, I felt emptied in a way that was both terrifying and necessary. When I stopped, she closed her notebook and didn't say anything right away. She simply sat there, hands resting on the cover, her gaze steady and unblinking, as if acknowledging silently that what I had given her wasn't just a confession. It was proof. She didn't have to promise me she would use it well. I could see it in the way she held herself, the way she seemed to lean toward me without moving, as if we were both standing at the edge of something vast. And in that quiet, I realized I had crossed a line I could never step back from. My story was no longer locked inside me. It was in her hands now, and soon it would be in the world. The weeks that followed felt like waiting for a storm I could hear, but not yet see. The journalist had been meticulous, chasing down every lead, verifying every detail I had given her, pairing my words with the documents, drafts, and testimonies she'd already gathered. She worked quietly, but I could feel the momentum building beneath the surface, like a current pulling everything toward one inevitable moment. And then the date was set. The profile would run on a Monday morning, the same week my story thief was launching her new book tour. It wasn't going to be buried in the gossip pages, where truth and rumor share the same breath. This would be front page art section, printed in the crisp, deliberate typeface reserved for work, meant to be taken seriously. It wouldn't scream. It wouldn't sensationalize. It would simply stand there in daylight, undeniable, impossible to skim past. I could already picture it, her face on the posters for her tour, smiling with that carefully rehearsed warmth, while beside it, in the racks of the morning paper, the truth would sit like a shadow she couldn't step out of. People would walk into her events already knowing, already looking at her differently, already wondering what else she had borrowed that didn't belong to her. The days crawled and flew at the same time. I found myself counting down without meaning to, 2 weeks, then 10 days, then 1 week. Every morning I woke with the sense that the air was a little heavier, the colors a little sharper. I avoided bookstores, avoided interviews, avoided anything that might stir the anger I was trying to keep steady. I wasn't looking for satisfaction in her downfall. What I wanted was something colder, cleaner, the restoration of what had been taken, and the permanence of proof. The night before the article was set to publish, I barely slept. I kept picturing the moment her phone would ring, or her email would ping, with someone sending her the link before she even stepped onto her first stage of the tour. I wondered if she would try to deny it, to call it jealousy, to weave some half-truth that would soften the blow. But no matter what she said, the words would already be out there, fixed in print, archived, waiting for anyone who needed to see them. It struck me then how different this felt from the confrontations I'd once imagined. This wasn't a shout across a crowded room. This was the quiet turning of a page in full view of the world. It was the kind of justice that didn't need to raise its voice, because the truth, once printed, once documented, didn't have to shout. It simply had to exist. And in less than 24 hours, it finally would. The morning it came out, the world felt unnervingly still, as if it were holding its breath. I woke before the sun, the sky still the color of unspilled ink, and sat in the kitchen with a mug of coffee I barely touched. My hands shook, not with fear exactly, but with the weight of knowing that by the end of the day, nothing would be the same. The journalist had sent me an advance link the night before, but I hadn't clicked it. I wanted to see it the way everyone else would, fresh, unfiltered, impossible to take back. When it finally went live, it didn't shout. The headline was precise, clean, stripped of theatrics, the uncredited life that inspired the bestseller. No accusations, no venom, just a quiet, devastating truth. And there, directly beneath it, was my name, not hidden in the last paragraph, not buried in acknowledgments no one reads, but placed where no one could miss it, where it belonged, where it had never been before. I stared at those words for so long that they began to blur, my breath catching in a way I hadn't felt since the first time I'd seen her book and realized what she'd done. Only this time it wasn't disbelief, it was reclamation. I scrolled through the piece slowly, the journalist's prose measured and deliberate, weaving my story through the fabric of evidence she'd gathered. She laid it out like a case file dressed in art. Dates, documents, the assistant's admission, passages from early drafts, my own words recorded in her careful notes. It was impossible to dismiss. It wasn't framed as bitterness. It wasn't painted as some petty rivalry. It was presented as fact, verifiable and clear, the kind of truth you can't wriggle away from without looking smaller in the attempt. And though my heart was pounding, I felt an odd calm settle over me, as if I had been holding my breath for years and was finally letting it out in one long exhale. Within hours, the ripple began. My phone lit up, messages from friends who had known pieces of the story but never the whole of it, from strangers who recognized themselves in the theft, from quiet acquaintances who had stood in lines for her signings and now felt a sting of betrayal on my behalf. Social media feeds filled with the link, readers dissecting the details, asking questions she could no longer answer without stepping into the trap her own lies had built. Somewhere that same morning she would have opened her laptop or her phone and seen it too. I imagined her in a hotel room, maybe moments away from the first stop on her tour, reading her own name tied to mine in a way she could never have wanted. And I wondered, would she feel anger, shame, or would she simply reach for the same mask she'd worn for years and hope it still fit? But that was the thing. It didn't matter anymore. For the first time since the day she called me forgettable, my name wasn't just remembered. It was recorded, printed, permanent. And I knew as I sat there with the morning light spilling across the kitchen table that no matter what she said, no matter how she tried to spin it, the truth had already found daylight. And daylight doesn't give it back. The reaction was faster and louder than I had dared to imagine. By noon that day, the article had been shared thousands of times, bouncing from inbox to inbox, post to post, until it was no longer just a story. It was a conversation the world had decided to have without her permission. Readers who had clutched her book to their chests now stared at it with a different kind of weight in their hands. The comment section swelled, first with disbelief. This can't be true. She wouldn't do that. And then, inevitably, with anger. How could she? How could anyone take something so personal and pretend it was theirs? Bookstores responded almost as quickly as the readers. In some, her new release was moved from the bright front tables to less prominent shelves, replaced by fresh stacks of other authors whose work hadn't been shadowed by controversy. In a few stores, the article itself was printed out and taped discreetly near the display, as if to say, "We know, we've read it too." I heard from someone who worked in one of the larger chains that a meeting had been called, that the higher-ups were monitoring the situation to decide whether keeping her as a marquee author was worth the backlash. And then there were the interviews, the same glossy morning shows and radio spots she had once breezed through with effortless charm. Only now, her smile looked tighter, her words more measured, the confident ease replaced by something brittle. My name appeared in every question, every introduction, every awkward pause where she scrambled for a safe response. The name she had once tossed aside with a smirk, calling it forgettable, was suddenly lodged in the public record, repeated on airwaves, printed in headlines, murmured in backstage whispers. She couldn't avoid it without avoiding the interviews altogether, and canceling would only make the questions louder. People began to reach out to me, former classmates, colleagues, distant acquaintances, each with their own mix of shock and vindication. Some admitted they'd read her book and felt uneasy, sensing a truth that didn't belong to her but unable to place it. Others confessed they had defended her against rumors in the past, and now regretted it. My inbox became a strange kind of chorus: outrage, sympathy, admiration, and the quiet recognition from those who had been erased in similar ways. Through it all, I didn't gloat. I didn't post triumphant messages or feed the frenzy. I simply let the truth do its work. It didn't need my voice to push it forward anymore. It had legs of its own. The damage to her image wasn't the result of a single explosive moment, but a slow, steady unraveling, thread by thread, until what she had wrapped herself in for years began to fall apart. And in every mention, in every retelling, in every incredulous conversation sparked by the article, my name stood where it had never been allowed before. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dressed in drama, it was simply there, undeniable, in print and in memory. And for the first time since this all began, I felt the deep, anchoring truth of it. Forgettable was no longer a word that belonged to me. Months passed, and the noise eventually faded, not because people forgot, but because the truth had settled into place, like a stone that will not be moved. The article was no longer the storm on everyone's lips, but it had done what storms are meant to do: clear the air, strip away the rot, leave the landscape changed. My life felt quieter now, and in that quiet, I began to understand something I hadn't before. Vindication isn't loud. It doesn't live in the headlines or the comment threads. It lives in the steady, unshakable knowledge that the truth is no longer in hiding. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail, the kind written in neat, looping handwriting that speaks of care and time. It was from a teacher I'd never met. She explained that she was teaching a course on literature and ethics, and for the next semester, her students would be reading two things side by side: the bestseller that had carried my life under someone else's name, and the article that finally returned it to me. She wanted her class to discuss not just the artistry of words, but the ownership of them, to examine whose voice history remembers and whose it tries to erase. I read that letter 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to hold on to the way it made me feel. For so long, I had fought against disappearing, against becoming a ghost in my own story. And now here was proof that not only had I been restored, but I had become part of something larger, a conversation that would outlast both me and the one who had taken from me. Students who hadn't been born when that night first shattered my life would one day sit in a room and say my name, connect it to my words, and understand what it means to lose ownership of your own truth, and to take it back. I smiled, not the fleeting smile of relief, but the deeper kind that comes when you realize you've built something that cannot be undone. My story was no longer just a memory in my head, vulnerable to time and the erosion of retellings. It was documented, printed, archived, carried into classrooms, preserved in the ink of 1,000 copies that could not be recalled or rewritten. Applause fades, headlines fade, even outrage fades, but a record that lasts. And somewhere, long after both our names have turned into history, someone will still read those pages, see the truth laid bare, and know exactly whose story it was all along.